Well, appears to be 2:05, so we will begin. This is the What Can You Say to a Young Adult panel, and I am moderating as Eneasz Brodski. I'd like to go down the table and have everyone introduce themselves, and also, since introductions sometimes are boring, also tell us what novel you read during your YA years that was most formative to you, and would it be considered YA by today's standards, in your opinion?
Here's card questions. Okay, so we just go down the line?
Yeah.
Good,
My name is Dan Wells, and I'm invisible. And half the room doesn't know if I'm lying or not. Okay, so
I see your hat.
I write everything, I guess. Some of it is YA. Most of what I write, I guess, is YA. The Partial series is the main one. I Am Not a Serial Killer is true and is also the title of a book that I have written. And what book? See, the book that I always point to as kind of the one that made me want to be a writer, so that's as about as formative as you can get, is the Christopher Robin poems by A.A. Milne. And so that's not, I don't know if that counts as YA, because that's like low, middle grade poetry. An actual book?
I know, it's so hard. Brain fast.
Okay, so the book that convinced me that I could do it, that I could actually, write books and be a writer, was Empire of the East, a fantasy novel by Fred Saberhagen, which I think today would totally be published as YA. It was not published as YA 30 years ago, but today it would be.
I didn't realize the last part of that question we were supposed to say what book made us want to write. Was that what you added to that, Dan?
Favorite YA book?
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, good. I don't know about all the YA. I've always loved writing. My name's Amanda Strong, and I write YA. I do mostly paranormal. I have a little sci-fi thriller series as well. When I think back to the books that I read when I was younger, the two that really stood out to me were Ender's Game, which I guess is still considered pretty YA, and Phantom of the Opera. I was obsessed with Phantom, so I love that. Those two stand out to me when I read younger. And you're there.
My name's Gail Wagner. I write YA. I have a paranormal series. I also have a fantasy series. Sorry. Okay.
Talk soft. Oh, she's my friend. They can't hear you.
Okay. So the books that I read everything. I'm still that way. I will read back to shampoo bottles if I get bored enough. I read anything by Lois Lowry. I loved her, and I think she's technically middle grade now, probably. It's like The Giver, Number of the Stars, and I read a lot of classics. I love Jane Austen, and I guess, I don't know, is she considered YA? I don't know. So there you go. I'm Michelle Kellogg, and I write under the pen name Michaela Mills. I mostly write young adult, but I do write some that's not young adult, but primarily I do write young adult. It's a really difficult question for me, because when I was growing up, my mom really pushed me to read books that were far beyond what most people of that age would read. So the book that is standing out to me, which is most definitely not young adult, is Exodus by Leon Uris. And also Anna Karenina. So it's like, those are the kind of books that I read when I was growing up, and then I guess I devolved. As I got older, it's like, no, I want something a little bit more simplistic, a little bit more me. Fun. Yeah, fun. That's a good word too. So, I mean, now if I were to consider things now, I would have to say it's the Harry Potter series, because it encompasses everything that I love about young adult and coming of age and just life in general.
I'm Angie Hodapp. I work for Nelson Literary Agency. We represent Marie Lu, who wrote the Prodigy series. The Legend series, Prodigy. Allie Carter, who wrote Uncommon Criminals, the High Society series, the Gallagher Girls series. Those are probably our two biggest YA clients. Personally, I write romance, science fiction, fantasy. I have a degree in secondary education and a former junior high English teacher. So YA Lit is dear to my heart. The book that I remember most was, I don't remember the title, Has anyone ever seen that blog where they make fun of all the covers of old YA books from the 80s? This book exists on that blog. It was this horrible story of these 4 high school girls, and this is in the 80s. Remember, this is the Gem, the Barbie and the Rocker era. It was these 4 high school girls who started, who started a band, and their forays into stardom. And one of them had sex with the manager of the band, and it was on the page. And so here I am. I was in like 8th grade. And I was certain if my mom saw the cover of the book, she would know what I was reading. So I think I read that book over and over and over again. And she did. It's like, wow, like my first introduction to sex and YA literature.
I am actually really interested in both those answers because I'm trying to get at this panel what kids want when they're of that coming of age. And it seems to me like sometimes that isn't what is allowed to be in the books. But before we get to there, the American Library Association defines YA as aimed at someone between 12 and 18, and a lot of more casual YA is defined as for ages 16 to 25, which is a very different spread. And I was wondering, how do you think of the YA genre, and what differentiates YA from traditional adult? If we could start at that and then come back.
I think young adult, the most obvious answer would be that the character is a young adult, someone who is coming of age. A young adult storyline typically has a first, a seminal experience of some sort, whether it's a first love, a first heartbreak, a first experience with death, a first experience with losing a parent or dealing with a friend who has an addiction. Kind of those first experiences where you realize the world is a little bigger and you're a little smaller in it. And what was the second part of your question?
How does it differ from a traditional adult novel? I think you kind of covered that.
And here's how does it differ from the traditional adult novel? That's a really good question, and I'm going to bring up a book I just read recently that was marketed as young adult but has adult characters and adult themes in it. Has anyone read Codename Verity? It's a World War II book about 2 young women, and they're in their 20s, but the book was really marketed towards adults, and I fell in love with it from page 1. So I'm not, I think it's maybe a marketing distinction, really, that someone somewhere, some publishing house decided that this book was going to be marketed to young adults, but really, it transcends that kind of a distinction for me anyway, so I'll pass that to someone else. I don't really know what more I can add to that because that was a pretty thorough answer. The only other thing that I would say is that generally young adult novels have more of that young adult theme. Again, going back to what she's talking about, but they do still have a lot of adult themes on top of that because they're coming into their adulthood. They're coming into learning about all of these adult themes that are happening to them and just learning how to deal with all of that kind of stuff. Everything from puberty to, getting ready for, sending in applications to college. They're all huge experiences for a kid. And just being able to discuss those in both positive and negative ways, and showing the truth behind it at times too.
I don't know. I really don't think we can add any more to what is YA, because
Right?
For the differing thing, I think for me the biggest thing is I clearly am an adult.
Clearly, we're adults.
But I read exclusively YA, and the reason that I read YA as an adult is because I appreciate the faster pacing. I appreciate that there's not long passages of description that me as my ADHD self, I'm smarting through it. So I think a lot of it is to do that they're typically a little shorter, not always. We have Twilight to prove that. Some Harry Potters. But they're just faster paced. You don't go very long before something exciting happens. And I think to me, that's the main difference.
If I can interrupt, when you write YA, what age do you imagine your reader to be?
Me?
I typically try to write crossover. I write it clean enough that I feel that if my daughter was 8 and was reading at an 11th grade reading level, so it was really hard to find stuff for her to read that was appropriate. So I try to keep it fairly clean, that I'm okay with her reading it, and then I try to keep it interesting enough that somebody like me that enjoys reading YA could read it. So I write for everybody.
I was going to say with YA, you have an interesting thing. You have kind of gatekeepers. There's certain level, you can't, some of the morality and violence and language, you're going to have that a little bit more because you have librarians and teachers and parents that are a lot more involved, where if you're writing adults, it's kind of wherever it can go. So I think where you decide where the level you're comfortable with your book also determines where you're going to end up marketing it, because like Gail was saying, if you have a crossover, it's nice when you write your teens. They might be teen characters, but it's relatively clean. You can appeal to third graders, but it also has enough complex, the conflicts and the plot is complex enough to appeal to someone in their 60s that's or 50s or 40s, or a lot of YA readers are moms and 30s and 40s. We end up, especially if there's romance elements, you appeal to a lot of that as well. So I think with YA, it's a little trickier because you do have to keep it. It's up to you how clean you want to keep it, but there is that element to it where other genres don't have that, because there are gatekeepers, and they'll you get in trouble when libraries can't order your books in as much and stuff like that.
I actually think, and this goes right with what she was just saying about who actually reads YA. Look at this room. We are overwhelmingly older than 18, older than 25. I think it is ridiculous to define YA by age. It makes no sense at all, because everybody reads it. And so really what YA means to me is this book is entertaining and stuff happens in it. So I guess that answers your second question about, how does it differ from adult books? Well, it's entertaining and stuff happens in it. Books, you look at what qualifies today as mainstream adult literary fiction, and half of them are about college English professors having a midlife crisis and an affair with their students. And that's because they're being written by college English professors having a midlife crisis and an affair with their students. They're just writing what they know. And it's this, dreadful reflection on whatever. And some of them are brilliantly written and wonderful. And I don't want to bash that half of literature, but even though I did. But really, there is a massive market for books that are entertaining and stuff happens, and we all read it, and we call it young adult because I think we're embarrassed by it. And you look at stuff like Washington Post, where, every month they come out with some new editorial about how YA is ridiculous. The one a couple years ago that said, you should be embarrassed for any adult. And, the fascinating part of that editorial, and it sounds like you guys are thinking of the same one, is the guy came right out and he said, it doesn't matter if it is the most brilliant book ever written. It's a young adult book, and adults shouldn't read it, which is the most clear-cut case of judging a book by its cover I have ever heard. And so, they're awesome books, and we love to read them. And so... Yeah, and so they're entertaining and stuff happens. What was the other one? Who do you think of your audience as you write? Yeah. I just write for myself. I rarely ever think about a specific audience or age group or demographic. I'm just writing what I think is awesome. And then the publisher says, well, you've written another YA novel. You must be an adolescent person. So there you go.
I have no problem bashing literary fiction. I refer to it as Earthfic because it's like fan fiction except it takes place on Earth. Not good stuff. This is why I read genre. You get to actually create a world. So we've determined that YA isn't necessarily an age thing. It's more of a content thing. In which case, I'm wondering, what is the content? What are the limits? For example, sex and violence, I assume, is lower in YA than you would get in more adult-oriented sci-fi or fantasy. How far are you allowed to go, both in violence and in sex? How intense can you be? Or how explicit?
I think if you're writing middle grade, you need to keep it really clean. But you look at people like Holly Black, and some of her books have more sex and violence than most of the adult books that I read. I don't think that there is a hard upper limit on it. You do have to sometimes worry about the gatekeepers, like she said.
You get parents.
And if you're willing to deal with the parents complaining that there's too much whatever in your books, then that's fine. Go ahead and write whatever. Kids are amazingly good at policing their own comfort level as they read. My first series, which was not initially marketed as YA, but is generally considered such right now, was about a teenage sociopath who is obsessed with death and serial killers. It's very disturbing. It's very dark. Parts of it are very gruesome. I've had 11-year-olds tell me that it is the funniest book they've ever read, and I've had grown women tell me that it's disgusting. But I always think back to when Coraline came out, and Neil Gaiman was in an interview, and he said that he gets complaint letters all the time from adults saying that his book is too dark or too scary or too whatever, and he has never once gotten one of those from a child. Yes.
Huh, okay, well, I agree with you. Whoops, there goes a lightsaber. No, I totally agree with you, but I think also once you start getting a few books out and you get your fan base, and I think that you kind of owe a little bit to your readers. Once they get to know you, I mean, I'm all for like writing for yourself, but you start getting a few people that like really follow you and they come to expect. For example, I write YA, but it's relatively clean. And I have readers and parents and people always messaging me going, I have no problem, I will buy all your books because I know what to expect. I know there might be violence and all that, but like for sex and things like that, it's not in the forefront of the book. And there's a lot of parents, I guess volunteering in the community and stuff, you start to see how many parents out there that are kind of fed up with YA that goes too far, and they want their kids to be able to read stuff. So, I mean, it's all comfort level, and everybody to each their own. But, like, for me, I do take that I do think about it. I actually do have it in the back of my mind, like, how far do I want to go? Now, granted, sometimes I feel like this has to happen in my book, there's something that has to happen, and I hope my readers that it's okay, but I am aware of it, and I think about it when it comes to that kind of stuff with YA especially, so...
I'm with Amanda. I think, we've talked about your own personal comfort level, and I think that's the key. Because I really think with YA, you can kind of go wherever you want with it. And I write very clean. In fact, when I started my first series, I was so uncomfortable writing kissing scenes. I actually wrote it into the plot that my main character couldn't kiss anybody. Like, she was incapable of it.
That's terrible.
I know. And then I wrote myself into a corner of it with the rest of the series, so I'm having to work with that. But I have gotten more comfortable with that in my newer series. They do have kissing scenes, but I tend to keep it that's as far as it goes. And I have it so that makes sense, because you also run into that where you have people that write books and you're like, why aren't these people sleeping together? This doesn't make sense. Because in today's world, that's a very real part of our world. So there has to be some reason behind it, whatever that may be, but it needs to be believable.
Well, a lot of what I write is young adult, but it's realism in content, and so I do write some fantasy, but it's mostly realism. Like my current novel is about a girl who's driving with her best friend. They get into an accident, her best friend dies, and then she's charged with texting and driving. So, I try and put a lot of that realism in there, but there are times when you have to have some of that realistic violence or rawness. A book that talks about attempted suicide even, and opening up that discussion. We can't, there are some things we can't skirt around because you can use those moments as educational moments. And when it comes to sex, too, I mean, we're not writing sex manuals here. We're not writing, the joy of sex for kids. That would just be wrong on so many levels. But, there's ways to approach things like that without it becoming smut. Fade to black. That kind of thing, where it's assumed or whatnot, or just not even discussed because it's not central to the story. Sorry. No, you don't want to belittle what they're feeling, because we've all been there. We all know what's going on. And with the suicide and everything, you want to address that
it's legitimate feelings, and that there are people that understand that. You don't want to gloss over it. Like, that never happens.
Right.
You don't want to do that either.
Mad. Your readers will be mad at you. You'll get, like, mad.
Oh, yeah.
Mad.
They can sense inauthenticity.
So we have a good friend, an author here named Aaron Michael Ritchie. He's up at the Wordfire Press booth. And by the way, you're all invited, if you're in this room, to the Wordfire Press launch party tonight at the Hilton Garden in room 906 at 8 p.m. That's from Mario.
Yeah.
Mario's book is going to be one of 3 books launched there. So
It's a secret party.
Secret special party, you're all invited. Spread the word. But speaking of Aaron Michael Ritchie, he writes young adult, and he attends a lot of events like this, and he does a lot of hand selling. And what he does, I think, is really, really smart. He will give each of his books, nowhere in print on the book, but he'll give it a rating based on the Major Motion Picture Association's rating system so that he can talk to parents. So he makes parents and librarians his allies. He doesn't say, oh, you know, I'm gonna slip you this book because there's a little sex in it, don't tell your mom. He's very open and honest with parents about what the contents of his books are. He can say this is a PG book, this is this might have a little NC-17 going on. And I think that's really, really smart to really bring parents in. The other side of that, we have another friend named Bree Urban, who is, if there was such a thing as an independent study for a PhD in young adult literature, she would have earned it 7 times over. She's read just about everything out there. And she parents by books. So she's a 9-year-old daughter who says, Mom, I want to read this book. And Bree knows that there's explicit sex in the book. And she says, okay, would you read it? And then when you're done, make an appointment with me and we'll go have coffee and talk about it. And her daughter will have very open and frank questions like, why do teenage girls act this way? Or why do teenage boys act this way? Or what's going on here? And I think that's just so brilliant. And her kids, you can just see it, that they've got this intelligence because they're readers and they have access to anything they want to read.
Your movie rating thing brought something to mind. I've noticed, my parents are from Europe, that the U.S. seems to have very different points of view on sex and on violence, almost reverse to how Europe is. What kind of violence can you get away with a PG rating? Because I remember once watching network TV, The Quick and the Dead, and they edited out Sharon Stone's crotch scene or whatever where we saw her panties. But then 5 minutes later, someone got shot through the head, and the camera panned behind them, and you saw the view of the duelist through the guy's brain. I was like, how did that make it on TV? Do you feel like that's hypocritical at all, and do you feel that you can get away with more violence than sex?
Can you get away with more violence than sex? I think you can. I don't know if that's right or wrong, really. I think if you're struggling with that in a book that you're writing, like it has already been said before, write the story the best way you know how, the way it has to be told. If you're pursuing a traditional publishing path, allow your team that you'll have down the road, your agent, your editor, whoever's acquiring your book, the publishing house, they'll sit down and tell you, hey, we love your writing, we love your story, but it's the market we're looking to fill is not really going to be happy with this book. Here's some changes we hope to make. And they might ask you to tone down the sex or to tone down the violence. Or they might say, hey, this is a really violent scene and you're kind of sweeping it under the rug. Let's have a little more realism here. So, hopefully you'll have those teams in place to...
I'm raising my hand.
Oh, I know, I was too let's go.
Jump in. Well, my first book, my editor, they actually made me go put more romance in. So they do watch that too. They were like, you got to give us something in this book. So
yeah. Well, I was going to say, can you hear me okay? I feel like I'm getting real cozy here. Okay, thank you. Well, my publishing house is called Clean Team Publishing, and it's not that every book they publish is clean. They actually put a rating on the back of every book, and it has a little tree that has violence, and it has language, and it has, sexual, all the different ones. And it rates your book, so parents or teens can pick it up and go, oh, this one's a 1 on language, so there's no swear words. So I found it interesting when you said that, because I say, oh, I write clean, but my books are 4s and 5s in violence, and 2s in intimacy, so apparently I know what I'm more comfortable writing a little further and deeper into is the more violent aspect, but I think that's something, gets brought up a lot of times how needed it is, because you've got a 12-year-old they can read, like her daughter reading 11th grade at 9 years old. It's really hard. It depends as parents and readers what you want to subject your children to. It's awesome that she was comfortable letting her 9-year-old read about these things, but for me personally, my 9-year-old, no, I don't want him getting too far into things he can't understand. So I think a rating system is so needed. It's something they need in YA especially. I don't know if that answered your question. That's just my 2 bits on it.
And I would also say that I think it depends on the genre. I mean, like you would expect less violence in a romance than you would in a zombie novel
or a fantasy,
or something like that. So I think a lot of it really is kind of like a sliding scale.
I just got back a couple of months ago from living in Germany. I was there for 2 years. And so you're absolutely right. Our American moral system, I guess, is kind of totally reversed. And it was shocking for me as an American to go over there and, drive down the road with my kids and see a topless billboard and go, okay, everyone look out the left window for the next 10 seconds. And meanwhile, thoughts of violence are so anathema to them over there. And the idea that every American owns a gun and uses them shocks them. And they think that's just ridiculous. We kept trying to get our friends to say, okay, once we move back, come visit us. Like, no. You guys live in the frigging Wild West. And so there is, a very different mindset. And, we could have a long and probably fruitless conversation about why. It would be fun. I do think actually the Wild West has a lot to do with it, because we have a strong tradition of violence in our country, that Europe hasn't had for hundreds of years. You go back hundreds of years for them, and there were kings. There was a feudal system. They relied on someone else to protect them. Whereas you only have to go back about 100 years in America to the point where we had to protect our own homes with our own guns from bad guys. And, that culture is still around, even if it's in the background, invisible. Yeah.
I think we're just more independent almost. Like, we take care of ourselves.
Yeah, we're going to do things ourselves. We're going to do this. And so I think violence is a part of that. Plus, we're a nation settled by Puritans, and so we're all terrified by sex altogether. I got a really, really interesting email about a month ago. I've been thinking about it ever since, because there was a kid who wrote to me about John Cleaver, who's the main character of my serial killer series. And he said that he had come up with this whole headcanon for what he called John's non-committal sexuality. And I'm like, are you serious? It's pretty clear in the book. But, for him it wasn't enough. It didn't go into it enough. And it made me think back to when I was a teenager, and, I don't think about sex nearly as much as I did when I was 15 years old. And it's a much bigger deal for that audience. And so the fact that my book kind of said, okay, here's the thing, and now we'll move on to the story, he's like, well, no, talk more about that thing. I want to hear way more about that thing. And so this, clearly heterosexual character in his head is like this kind of asexual, weird person, because I didn't go into it as far. And I've been thinking about that mindset. What does that say about me?
You need to be our 17-year-old.
15-year-old.
Obviously. And that's a good point, because at a conference 2 years ago, we were talking to a group of kids, and we were asking them, what do you think? You tell us, as teenagers, what do you see in literature? What do you want to see in literature? And one kid raised his hand and said, one thing that you authors always forget is that teens think about sex way more often than adults do. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's true. We certainly don't talk about it as much as teens do. At least not in front of teens, so you're not seeing it. But I don't know. At this point, I'm just babbling.
No? It's a good point.
This is perfect.
It's a good
This is
point.
what I was trying to root out when I pitched this panel. Are we writing for the teens or for their parents? Because you have mentioned a lot about the gatekeepers and how you got to work around them. Are the gatekeepers doing the children a disservice by saying, no, as parents, we don't think this is acceptable?
In part, I think yes, and I hope that that's controversial to say. I believe that one of the very greatest things about books is the ability to read something you're not ready for yet. And, we've all been there. We can look back when we were growing up, when most of us were growing up, there was not a clear YA section in the library. You just went in and found what looked good, and it had a cool thing on the cover, and you get halfway through, and oh my gosh, who put that in this book? And, I feel like a lot of kids today aren't having that experience if they don't have the guts to just wander instead of reading the thing their friends are all reading or the thing the librarian told them to read. Because kids as their own demographic have become their own gatekeeper as well with this very blockbuster reading culture that we have where everyone reads Divergent and everyone reads Maze Runner.
It's the thing to do.
And if you haven't read it, then you can't talk about it at lunch with your friends. And so they're kind of, I don't know if there's as much exploration as there used to be, and I think that we need more of it.
Are we going down the road? Or
You.
Okay. I think part of that is it's the whole comfort level thing again. As a reader, when I was a teen, I was not exploratory in that way. If I read a book and I hit a scene like that, I was like, whoa, I'm done. Because that's me.
But you were your own gatekeeper there.
I was my own gatekeeper. Honestly, my parents, I had a very high reading level, and they just kind of trusted me to police myself. And clearly I was a goody two-shoes and did police myself. But I think, as a parent, that scares me a little bit. But my kids are very young still, so of course I don't want them reading that kind of stuff. But, definitely as a teenager, I think sometimes we do almost police it a little bit. We probably do.
Well, I know my daughter's 12. She'll be 13 this summer, and while I have not banned her, for lack of a better term, from reading any books, with maybe the exception of 50 Shades of Grey. But she just doesn't seem all that interested. Like, she really is kind of her own self-gatekeeper. She's stuck in the Mortal Instruments and the Hunger Games and all
quite
of
a bit.
it.
I have read the Mortal Instruments, and there's quite a bit in there. It pushes the
She
boundary.
just started that one, so.
Okay.
Well, I read them, but I read them a long time ago, so I don't remember. I read too much, so I forget books. But she is kind of her own gatekeeper, and we've told her, if there's a book that you're unsure about, come to us. My husband or I, or to her teachers, or to our librarians, and say, do you think this is appropriate? But she never even bothers to ask. She's like, if I want to read it, I'll read it. And if I don't want to read it, I won't read it. And that's, for me, I like that attitude. But again, she's older. And then there's my son, who getting him to read is like, oh my gosh, it's awful. Although I was impressed. He was handed a free comic book upstairs yesterday, and he sat down in my booth and he read for 2 hours straight. I was like, what?
When I was a kid, I had very strict parents, so I had very high walls around what I could read and what I could not read. And all my friends are out there reading Stephen King and V.C. Andrews, and I was not allowed to read those filthy, filthy books, which of course I think turned me into a reader because I was speaking at school to read those filthy books. And, I'm not going to say that. I know my parents were doing the best they could at the time. They were doing what they thought was right for me, and I think that's most parents, no matter what conversation happens in their homes or around books. You mentioned peer groups too, as far as gatekeepers. There's the cool kids who've read this book, and the uncool kids who like Twilight. Jeez, people who like Twilight. So unfortunately, and that really hurts me because I think the biggest thing that we can do as adults is make sure that there's a culture of readers coming up behind us, right? And especially if we're writers. Any kid who wants to read anything, they're reading. I don't care if it's Twilight. They're reading. This is a good thing.
Make a quick point for you, or comment. Even though I like to keep it relatively clean, But when I get to my kissing scene, yes, that might be as far as they go. But I think there's a way as authors, you don't have to gloss over it either. I'm reading a book right now where I've been leading up to this kiss, and I'm like, yay, they're going to kiss. And it literally was like, he kissed her when he was done kissing her. And then it kept going, and I was like, oh my gosh, when I write a kissing scene, it lasts a few pages, okay? So I think there's a way you can still give those feelings, even if I decide these characters for some reason cannot go further, and there are reasons. And I think that's where you kind of, as an author, you can decide that. But you can give them the feelings and not, I think there's a way to writing it without it dumbing it down to the reader where they're like, she does not relate to me. And I'm in my 30s, so I was like, that was frustrating. Like, I wanted more, and I'm an older woman, so these teenagers, if you're reading something like that, they're like, oh, that was crappy, I want something to relate to. So I think there's still a way you can do it. There can be feeling there, but you don't have to go so far that
It's smutty.
Yeah, it's just whatever you're writing, what your audience is, and what your target is, and what you're trying to go for, I think. It's really wet.
So, as writers, this structure of YA where it has to be cleaner, well, do you consider that a challenge to overcome, or do you welcome that structure?
I welcome it. I know for me, the first complete novel I wrote, actually, it was not a young adult novel, and it did have a sex scene in it. I was so uncomfortable. She's read it, so she knows what I'm talking about. I was so uncomfortable writing that. Like, I'm uncomfortable reading it, I'm uncomfortable writing it, and I forced myself through it. But since then, I have yet to write another because it really was uncomfortable. And I think that came across, that discomfort came across in the novel. I actually had a good critique partner that helped me, for lack of a better term, flesh that out. I couldn't think of it. I'm sorry. but yeah, so that's, yeah.
She's like, I'm done.
With me, with the beginning, I said the whole YA for me it's the faster pacing.
Yeah.
So, and that is to me, that's the whole thing with YA. So I welcome that. Like, okay, I don't have to sit here and describe the front door of this big cathedral for 4 pages. I read a book like that.
Robert Jordan, anyone?
It wasn't Robert Jordan, and I like military series, so I know what she's talking about. But I welcome that I have an excuse to just kind of pick up the pace a little bit. Nobody expects me to. And also, I call it a skinny writer. Clearly not skinny, but my writing is skinny. I have a hard time getting a novel over 70,000 words. I really struggle with that. So for me, I could never write adult because I don't write long enough. I can't write a huge book.
Well, James Patterson books are rarely over 60 or 70,000. I don't know if adult means long. Yeah, and most of them aren't written by him anyway, but, I don't know, I had something to say, and then that comment totally derailed my train of thought, and I can't remember what it was. What was the question?
The question was, do you...
Oh, yeah, the boundaries of it. Well, again, I'm always just writing for myself, and maybe that's just super selfish and arrogant of me, but I'm always just thinking about me. What am I interested in reading? And, thus far, that has never turned to a sex scene, and the violence is never super bad. I kind of feel like the 5 of us up here are only representing a part of YA, though, because there are a lot of YA books that go way further than it seems like any of us go. And so what we're saying is only representing a part of the genre.
I think what we've said is, write what you're comfortable with. And I think your audience will take care of itself. My agent told me, she's like, there's always a market for well-written literature. Even if there's not if it doesn't fit in a specific. When I started writing, my first book had characters that were like 24. And I'm like, well, it's not adult, it's geared more towards young adults. And she's like, well, you're in no man's land, nobody's even going to want that. And now there's a whole new genre called new adult, which completely focuses on that college age, which is amazing because that's an amazing time of life. But it's that whole, write for yourself. I do. I feel like if you don't write what you're interested in, nobody else is going to be interested in it. If you force it, it's not going to be good. So just write what you're comfortable with, and write for your, write what's interesting to you, and then the rest will kind of take care of itself, I think.
I had a curious question about that. I remember going back and watching Animaniacs not too long ago, which was a show I watched a lot as a kid. And I noticed a lot of jokes that would have gone right over my head as a child that were clearly aimed at the adults, some of them kind of off-color. Do any of you put anything like that into writing sometimes, that you figure if these kids reread this as an adult, it's going to smack them in the head?
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yes.
I would like to think that.
Certain characters.
Mine are mostly in the form of puns, as evidenced by earlier my unintentional pun. But a lot of those do go over the heads of the younger generation. Like my daughter, she's just now starting to understand what a pun is. But I throw a lot of that stuff in just because it's me, and that's my life. I'm sarcastic and punny, and sarcasm doesn't go over very well with a lot of the younger kids either because they don't understand it as well. So as they get older, then they do start to understand it.
We're all nodding. Yes, we do. That's our answer.
Well, my final question down here was, I've got a few others, but the one I wanted to get to, which I think has kind of already been answered throughout this panel, is why write YA? Does anyone want to add anything to that?
Why not? Yeah.
I think with all the debate that there has been with, you should be absolutely embarrassed to read YA if you are over the age of, 16. I think that, we always talk about shaming and bullying. I'm like, is that just the same thing? I mean, you're shaming somebody because they're reading. And even as an adult, I think even more so as an adult sometimes, it is hard to find time to read. And this is coming from a writer. It is hard to find time to read. So I think if anybody is reading anything, yay, exactly. So I don't see why not, exactly. Why not write YA?
Well, and it's brain science. If anyone caught the panel yesterday on writing characters that don't suck, Molly Tanzer made a brilliant point about, I think it was Molly. When you read something, this is Molly. I don't know exactly what that means. Anyway, when you read about your characters going through stress, right? And you're comfortable, you're in your bathtub or your lawn chair, you're reading a book, and you're not in a position of any peril. But as you read a character going through peril, your brain doesn't know the difference, right? It's experiencing what the character is experiencing. That's why attention on every page is so important. That's why people who read romance read 5 romance novels every week, because they experience the whole process of falling in love 5 different times in that week. And with young adult, it's the same thing. We experience a new thing for the first time every time we read a well-written young adult book, and it's beautiful. And we should be allowed to do that at any age.
So on Twitter last week, Shannon Hale said something that I thought was really interesting. She said, "It's so great to see YA getting so much coverage and so much attention, it's almost like young people's stories matter." And I thought, on the one hand, that's a super weird thing to say, because I have never felt in 40 years that young people's stories didn't matter. Even as a kid, back before YA was a thing, I was always still able to find stories that spoke to me. But as an answer to this question, I think it's a perfect answer. Because why write YA? Because young people read. And why would we not write books for them? That's ridiculous.
Well, and I think, you look at it from a marketing perspective too. YA is hot right now. So, let's be honest here, that plays a role in it too. If you're serious about wanting to be published and such too. Now, of course, that you also face, oversaturation in the market and things like that as well. But it's a big market right now.
Before I get to this, are there any questions?
I actually have one question. It really centers on language and speaking of characters within the book. Because, if you listen to Kiwi's talk now, there's a lot of older language that come out of their mouth on a daily basis. And I kind of feel like I need to put some of that in the book, but at the same time, I kind of feel it shouldn't be in the book. So how does this feel?
Hard.
I think this goes back to your comfort level. I try to keep away from slang so much, simply because I think it dates your book. what they're saying today, 5 years from now, they're probably not going to be saying. As far as vulgarity, I think it depends on your character. If you have a character that would use that, sorry, totally took your thing. Don't just throw it in for the sake of having it so the kids can relate to it. That's no good. But if you have a character that would honestly, that's what they're going to say. I don't swear. Again, goody two shoes. I don't swear, but every once in a while, I swear in my books because I'm sorry saying, we're going to darn well get this done. It sounds ridiculous. My character's going to be like, damn straight. It's just that whole, I want it to be realistic. So, that's me. Sorry.
I would say as a writer, for me, level of vulgarity or profanity is less important in capturing how a young person talks than just the rhythm of speech. I mean, specific slang that will date your book, like she said, can be problematic, but hang out, in a non-creepy way, hang out with some kids and listen to them talk, and they don't talk like adults. No. And so much YA sounds like adults in tiny bodies. And if you can find a way to capture that, sense of the incomplete sentences and different things, I am constantly going through every copy edit and saying, nope, I realize that you're correcting this so it's grammatically perfect, but that's not how human beings talk.
Right.
We're trying to capture what teenagers sound like.
But you don't want to go too far where it's like, yeah, and there's all these added words because that's horrible. Just give the flavor of it, the taste of it. But it is really hard because I wrote a character where I was like, he's a 17-year-old boy. He's hanging out. I mean, I'm like, he should be just letting all sorts of words fly. And then I realized for my book and what I wanted, I didn't really want my book to be pulled away from all the readers I wanted. It's angels and demons. It has a very religious theme. So do I want the readers to be offended that are drawn to that maybe don't, So it was really a toss-up. So I had to get a little creative. I had to make him talk a little more, made up his own little terms, and he actually made his character. But, it's hard. I think that's just really up to you and your book and where you're going with it. But I think that's a hard one, actually. I struggle with that one.
Any other questions?
From an educator's standpoint, let's say you're an English teacher, and you have a book that does sort of push the boundaries of what you can classify as an adult. The experience of holding up a book and halfway through going, oh, I didn't expect that. How do you justify recommending that kids read those books for that experience to parents who say, why is my child reading this book in your class? Things like banned books.
Mm-hmm.
You have all these books that are banned, and you tell the kids to read them. How do you justify that?
I'm like, I heard two breaths, so I was like, I'll just sit this one out.
It's hard, and I left public education, because I have a lot of angst over that exact question. And I taught the Holocaust. We taught ninth. And I had parents who were like, my ninth grader is too precious to learn about the Holocaust. And I'm like, seriously?
Different.
Okay, he can sit in the library for the next 6 weeks because this is what we're reading. Yeah. But I had district support as well because we had a pool of literature we could choose from and choose to teach. But I also was very open to having those conversations with parents. And, can you share with me what your concerns are? And have you read the book yourself? And maybe you and I can talk about the book. And it is one of those above and beyond things that educators really have to do nowadays to get parents on board. That's a great question. Coming from the standpoint of being a student and being required to read certain books at certain grade levels, I had a really hard time. I think, just from the student's point of view, particularly if they're uncomfortable with it, I always felt like my teacher should give me an alternate assignment kind of thing. Just have something else that they could choose to read. My parents, my mom was not the kind of mom that would have gone down and started and like, why are you making my kid read this? Because that's just a hush list. But you do have to do it, because I would be upset if my child was assigned certain books. I'm not a huge policer, but certain books I just don't feel like the teachers have the right to say, you can read this, because it's down to the parents having the right to say, we don't do this in our family. So again, it's that really hard. It's a really hard question.
I always think of the story of Sleeping Beauty, where someone said, your daughter, when she turns 16, is going to encounter something that will ruin her life. How are you going to save her from this? And her parents' plan was to hide it from her. And that is such a brilliant metaphor for childhood sex education. If you actually, if they had taken Sleeping Beauty and said, here's a spinning wheel, here's how you use it properly, she never would have had any problems. But instead, the first time she encountered it on the street, or however you want to spin this, no pun intended, she used it wrong and it ruined her life. And kids need to know about this stuff. And so, I don't know if I can give you specific advice, but look at the statistics of, what they're finding out now is, teen pregnancies are happening younger and younger every year. And so, when you've got national statistics showing, teen pregnancies as young as 13 and 14 years old, and if we're saying a book about a teenage pregnancy is too scary or too real for our children to read, no, that is exactly the world they're swimming in. That is what they need to be learning about. And, yes, that's great if the parents are going to step up and teach their children, but nationally, on a statistical level, they are not. And so if we have that opportunity to do that and say, well, okay, here's a book about drug use. I realize drug use is bad. This book also realizes drug use is bad. It's not going to tell your kids to use drugs. It's going to portray the use of drugs in a realistic way so that your kids can know more about it. And, all of these different kinds of things, they need to know that. And we're falling down as adults, and we're not giving them the education they need.
I heard once they were saying, if you think it's about time to talk to your kids about sex and drugs and all the things, they're like, you're about 3 years too late, because they've already, or maybe more now, it's probably like 5 years, but you're already too late. They already know about it, and it's not maybe how you wanted them to see it or believe it. And so I agree with you 100%. I mean, it is tough. And I think like books like that teach them and say, you know what, this is what could happen if you're on drugs. That's great. There's a difference. But it's really hard with the education system and stuff. It's really a fine line. It goes both ways. You got parents and teachers and the kids in the middle of what's best. So,
I really wish we could keep going.
I just wanted to say I'm not an educator, but from a parent standpoint and having a tween daughter who's almost a teen, I know my kids' teachers, they'll offer 3 different books in an assignment that cover those same topics, but one is more in a calm way, one's more in your face, that kind of thing. That's how they've handled it, and I really appreciate that. And like I said, I'm fine with her reading whatever she wants. She gets to choose, but that's how they've handled it.
We're already over. Thank everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank our awesome panelists.